your sensor can have atoms in this vapor cell. We heard it's glass cells, it's MEMS-based cells, something that you make fairly small. You can make them in parallel on wafers. You have lasers. So we want to use lasers that are small, low power as well, because we have to put them into that small black box, and detectors. So it's really these simple components that you can use to miniaturize the sensors. And then, of course, you have to also look at your control system, because again, the user doesn't care if your black box is your physics package, so your laser, your atoms, or if it's the battery, or if it's the control system that's running it. And so we have to be able to also use look at those things that my laser controller has to be able to be miniaturized, and everything can fit in this small box. But for vapor cell-based systems, especially for alkali systems, you can get low power lasers that are really small. You can make control systems that are small. You can miniaturize your system very well. And so simplicity often relates to low swap plus C. So low size, weight, power, and costs. If you can keep your system simple, the fewer lasers you have to use, the better. The smaller you can engineer your cells and control systems, the better. And so we often use kind of very simple atomic systems right now. It also then creates a platform as we're developing more and more complicated quantum 2 type systems to use that same pathway and the same fabrication methods to translate that into applications. And so these systems, we have our atoms, and they're flying around in our vapor cell. And we also heard already, like, we always have a state preparation. So we pump atomic spins into some state, we let it evolve, and then we read it out. And that can happen either in sequentially, or it can happen simultaneously, that we pump and probe at the same time. We can often even use the same laser for pumping and probing, and that precession can happen continuously. But that is really now where it starts differentiating what type of sensor, what type of magnetometer are we building. But the building blocks are always the same: some kind of state preparation, some kind of evolution, and some kind of readout. And so one thing besides that I can actually make it small is that I can also retain very good performance even though I make it small. And so this is an example of a chip scale atomic clock, where a long time ago we looked at the scaling of what if we made our sensor smaller and smaller and smaller. And you lose two ways. One way, so this is kind of the fractional frequency stability of a clock. So how well can you measure time at 1 second, and then you can integrate down? And it's really dependent on your signal to noise ratio and your Q factor of your system. And both of those suffer as you make it smaller. So your Q factor is getting worse, or your line width is getting broader, because the atoms are colliding with the walls of the container more. There's more walls per volume as you make it smaller. So you lose. And then also your signal to noise is suffering because you have fewer atoms. You can put fewer power through, so you get a higher shot noise. And so in both cases you lose. And you can, if you look at this performance as a function of cell size, and that's just one length, you can see that it's getting worse. But if you look at how good can my clock be when it's when I'm down at 1 millimeter, it is still a really good clock. 10 to minus 11 at 1 second is a good clock. And so this was really a game changer from an applications perspective, that now I could make an atomic clock with a stability that was comparable to at that point, to the GPS clocks. By now, things are a lot better. This was like 2002, as you can see. That is, where the whole clock is the size of a sugar cube, 1 cubic centimeter, so a physics package of a grain of rice that I showed you before, and a power of a AA battery in 24 hours. And the game changer here was really an atomic clock that can run on a battery. that's what made the difference in the application space, that before you needed like a car type battery. Now you could use a AA battery, and while you still retain that high sensitivity. And so that's what we're looking for when we're trying to translate these sensors into applications. Where's that niche space that gives us now an advantage? And for the atomic clock, it was the battery operation.
Sorry, there in this cubic centimeter is just the physics package, right? Lasers and atoms, but like all the electronics to run it is probably still quite a chunk or not?
No, it's inside.
Including data acquisition and log electronics and some PC
Yes.
and whatnot?
Yes, it was all inside the 1 cubic
Oh, that's
centimeter.
crazy.
So your physics package was the grain of rice when I showed you, 10 cubic millimeters. And then there's the RF oscillator that you need, which was also 10 milliwatts and about the same size. And then the rest was control electronics, and it was all combined.
And what's the output basically? I mean, just time as digitized digitally as a...
So it's a stable frequency that comes out. In this size, the frequency unfortunately was in the gigahertz range, which is not what the user wants. They want a clean 10 megahertz, no modulation, and so on. And so that's where the difference came into when it was commercialized, that they actually made it, I think, about 4 times as big, so 4 cubic centimeter-ish. And they added these frequency converters to get a stable 1 PPS signal. So 10 megahertz clean signal out. So they locked it to an external oscillator again. So somehow I'm not happy with all of these Zoom thingies up there because they're right in my titles. Better, right? Okay. Okay. All right. Well, I can live with that better. Okay. So, but the talk today is really about magnetometers. And so one question is, why would you want to use an atomic magnetometer or optically pumped magnetometer? We use them as synonyms for imaging applications. And so first, again, as I said, similar to some of these other quantum sensors, accuracy, no calibration. We can send them into space and we don't have to go and tune that thing. That's important for some applications. Some other industrial applications too, you might just send them down in a borehole and you don't want to go and retune it because it changes with time or with temperature. And then, as I said, we can still get fairly high sensitivities or low noise floors out of them and have no moving parts. But if we talk about magnetic imaging, in most imaging applications, I would not use magnetic field sensors at all. If you can do it optically, you get a higher bandwidth, you have a much simpler system. Don't use magnetic fields. But the place where magnetic fields become important is when you want to image through dense media. So through the wall, through concrete, through water, through bone, where you just can't get optical fields in very well. And so the penetration depth of electromagnetic fields increases drastically as we go to lower frequencies. And so in this plot, it might not be the best one, but I just want you to look at the 2 blue lines. And so this is really the penetration depth of a 50 kilohertz signal versus a 50 kilohertz signal versus a 1 kilohertz signal. And so this was calculated for seawater, for example. How far can you transmit into the ocean? And so you can see that your penetration depth gets a lot longer as you go to these lower frequencies. And so when we talk about magnetic imaging, most of them are low frequency, somewhere close to DC, maybe 2 kilohertz or something like that. And so we really, in most cases, I'm going to talk about low frequency magnetic imaging because that's where a lot of these dense structures are transparent to magnetic fields. And so that's important for imaging. If it distorts my image because I get phase shifts or attenuation, that usually doesn't make a good imaging system. Okay, here we go. One thing I kind of want to show is there's lots of different types of atomic magnetometers. And so when we say we use these OPMs or we use these atomic magnetometers for different applications, we're really talking about a whole zoo and cluster of different types of magnetometers. And which one we choose is dependent on the application we're looking for. So I clustered them into 3 different types. One is what we call scalar magnetometers, total field sensors. What they measure is the Lama precession frequency. And the Lama precession frequency is proportional to the total magnetic field. So the scalar of the magnetic field, not one component or so. Then we can, and so what we do is we want to measure this total magnetic field. We'll put our sensor inside, and now we start driving it and trying to match that drive frequency or a multiple of it with the Lama frequency. And then in an RF sensor, we can turn it around. We're trying to now measure an RF frequency, and now we tune our DC field to, again, match this Lama condition where the drive frequency or the RF frequency matches my Lama frequency. And then the third cluster is what we call zero field magnetometers or Hanle magnetometers. And really all they can measure is my field zero or not? And that's where the surf magnetometers work as well. And I'm going to say a little bit more about that. And so the difference between kind of this cluster here, these 2 left ones and the right ones, is do I have a precession of the atoms, or is it just a static repolarization in the Hanle type? And so in most of these, I drive the atoms. But then I can drive different transitions. So that now starts distinguishing different types of magnetometers. I can drive a hyperfine transition, or I can drive a Zeeman transition. So I have resonances kind of somewhere in the gigahertz range or in the hundreds of kilohertz range. And then I can differentiate if I want to drive an orientation or an alignment, or in the energy space, do I want to couple neighboring energy levels or kind of higher order ones. And so that's kind of the next differentiation. And then finally, how am I going to drive that precession? Is it optically, or is it with magnetic fields, or do I not drive it at all and just watch it decay? And then I finally, if I want to drive this, I need to modulate. Like if I want to drive it optically, I need to somehow either amplitude or frequency modulate something. So I drive, I don't drive, because I need to switch something on and off at that Lama frequency or a multiple of it. And so all of these magnetometers, they're very similar in that they're driving some kind of polarization in the atoms, and they're driving it optically, or they're driving it magnetic fields. They're driving it on one or the other transitions. And so there's this whole zoo of magnetometers, but at the end, they work all in very similar ways. I need to drive this precession in the atoms unless I'm over there. And so that's been like confusing to users that are like, boy, which one do I pick? Why one or the other? And that's really where it goes into subtleties. And so what I wrote there as well is like fundamental sensitivities. They scale with the lengths to the 3/2. And so these fundamental sensitivities have been calculated for them. And then the experimental ones, a lot of them actually got, these are the best records, actually demonstrated performance in the lab that is just incredibly good and was getting very close to.
What is fundamental sensitivity? And what do you mean? Is spin projection noise, or?
It's a combination of spin projection noise and photon shot noise usually.
I'm surprised that there's like an ultimate limit to it, because I don't know, what does it assume? What atomic density does it assume, for example?
Well, it optimizes that, right? So it's in a given container size. So that's why it scales with size. If I make it bigger, it always gets better. I have more atoms. But let's say my container is fixed. then it says, let's say I start filling it with atoms. It gets better and better. I have more atoms that I can ask, right? But at some point, they start interacting, spin exchange, collisions of these atoms. So it gets worse again. So there's a clear minimum of where where I can optimize all of these parameters too. And so in the limit of this what we call fundamental noise sources of both the laser, which I need to read out, and the atoms, I can find an optimum. And this is the calculated optimum in these two limits.
Thanks.
One thing I want to talk about is these zero field magnetometers or Hanley magnetometers. And they, working in the spin exchange relaxation free regime, this what we call surf regime, has been really a game changer in the application space for some of these magnetometers, because it really improved the sensitivity limit by a factor of 100. And so it's a neat effect in that it's almost like too good to be true. And so, as I just described, right, I want more and more atoms because I can measure better with more atoms, but then they start colliding and then everything gets worse again. But and so what really happens is I have in my atom, this is maybe a simplified picture, but I have two hyperfine states. And so the atoms in one state process clockwise and the other state they process counterclockwise. And so I'm trying to put them in this nice spin state that's evolving, but then they hit each other and then they go the other way. And so that disrupts my phase. And so the more atoms I have, the more often they hit, I get these spin flips, which means they're now processing the other way. And so Will Happer already in the 70s said, I can suppress the decoherence from that flipping if I make them flip very often in one precession period. Because what happens is like they go this way, they go that way. But one of the spin states, they spend more time. So I get a net precession. I get a modified precession rate by the atoms flipping back and forth. And in average, they all spend the same time. And so I get still a precession, but that spin exchange decoherence from going back and forth gets suppressed. And so in this regime where I have lots and lots of atoms and they're processing slowly, I can completely suppress the decoherence from our biggest decoherence mechanism, and that was the atoms colliding. And I can now suddenly increase my number of atoms, my atomic density, and get a better and better performance. And so when I look at my line widths here, as I get more and more atoms, they're colliding, so it gets worse. And then suddenly I get in this regime where it totally drops. And then somewhere down here, it starts going up again. And so in this limit of small magnetic fields, so slow precession and lots of collisions, I can build magnetometers in the surf regime that have a noise floor that's suddenly, let's say, a factor of 100 better than what I could do before. But it is limited, that regime of low magnetic fields and high densities. And so in some applications, that works really well, and I'll talk more about that. So here are some of the magnetic imaging applications I'll tell you about today. And so I have plotted them as a function of the size scale of that magnetic imaging application. So going from kind of tens of kilometers as we look at space applications to kind of tens of microns in for microscopy applications. And so I'll talk to you about a few of these. And so let's start with kind of space applications. And so this is a program that we're working on with aerospace to build a magnetometer to put on a CubeSat or a constellation of CubeSats to measure or monitor the magnetic field of Earth from space with high accuracy. And that is feeding into the world magnetic model. So that's a model that NOAA that NOAA is making, and it's a predictive model, what Earth's magnetic field will do in the next 5 years. So, and that's important if we start to make maps for navigation and things like that. How is Earth's magnetic field changing? So they're interested in sending, yes, magnetometers up there.
Yes, for the small magnetometer imaging, we can understand, you can place the sensor at places, but for this large magnetic field model, can you please elaborate how can you imaging this?
How I can image it? Well, it's over time, so it keeps flying over, and eventually it'll monitor magnetic field all around Earth.
Like the sensor will be where at the space?
Yes, the sensor will go on a very small satellite. The satellite is 10 centimeters on the side and 60 centimeters long. And the sensor sits on that, and we send it up into space, and it just keeps monitoring Earth's magnetic field over time.
Okay.
And then that information will feed into this model we're making of Earth's magnetic field.
And what's NOAA?
National Oceanographic Ocean and Atmospheric Administration. So they make that predictive model based on lots of input, but the magnetic field is one of those inputs. But what they really want is a vector magnetometer, and the atoms, the Lambda frequency shifts with the total magnetic field. It doesn't give you anything about vector components. So our atoms are round in that sense. There's nothing that really distinguishes the direction. And so that has been one of these challenges. And then these things over here that are also on the satellite are star trackers. So they look at the stars and say the satellite is oriented in this direction. So they're giving us the reference frame of our vector magnetometer. And so what we can do is we can take a scalar magnetometer and we can actually vectorize it. So this is the scalar magnetometer we're using. It's an MZ magnetometer in this case. I have a small laser, I have a little bit of optics, I have my MEMS vapor cell, my photodiode, and my RF coils. And what I do is I measure the total magnetic field by locking the frequency of that RF coil to the Lambda frequency of the atoms. And so in this case, this is the sensor head. It's 2 by 2 by 4 centimeters. It has a small vapor cell that's 3 by 3 by 3 millimeters inside. And so the performance I get out of that is just under a picotesla per hertz. And so this is the performance of 2 of these sensors. This is the sensor 1 and sensor 2, and the difference is the green one, because it's really hard to measure magnetic fields at lower frequencies because my reference will drift away. So in order to actually see what my magnetometer is doing, I always have to take 2 and subtract them, if I'm on Earth at least. And so here, this is kind of the performance of the scalar magnetometer. And then I need to vectorize it. So what we do is we apply modulation fields simultaneously in 3 directions, and then we get 3 peaks of these 3 modulation fields. And if we measure the height of these peaks, we get the components of the magnetic field in that direction. And so the way the performance scaled is that I get it scales as the modulation amplitude of that modulation divided by the total magnetic field. So I get better and better if I have higher and higher modulation amplitudes. And so I need a sensor that has very high slew rate, very high bandwidth, so that I can move, so I can modulate with very large amplitudes. And so the MZ magnetometer we're using is probably not the best magnetometer for this. We really want something that has much higher bandwidth if we want to get better than this precision of half a nanotesla, which is the spec for this particular application, but I think we could do a lot better with a different type of magnetometer if we don't use MZ. And then, of course, we're also interested in accuracy. So this is kind of this goal of half a nanotesla. And so we it's a coil-based system, so we need to make sure that the coils don't drift away too fast. And then on orbit, we have to have recalibration schemes that recalibrate these coils, because at the end, we want a calibration-free magnetometer in space. So as our mechanical reference of the coils drifts away, we have to frequently recalibrate that. Yes. Yes.
What is the difference between the sensitivity and precision, and what is the sensitivity of this vector measurement?
Of the vector measurement, I think we lose about a factor of 500. So maybe half a nanotesla per hertz is the vector component sensitivity that comes exactly from this factor of modulation amplitude versus total magnetic field, because we can't modulate any higher than that. So it's about a factor of 500 from the scalar sensitivity. And that's limited by our slew rate, because our slew rate is about 10,000 nanotesla per second. So if we had a magnetometer with a much higher slew rate, then you could modulate higher, and then you get your noise floor on the vector component drops.
Slew rate is how fast it reflects changes in the magnetometer. It's basically bandwidth measurement, or?
It's related to bandwidth, yes. But it's really the amplitude change I can have at a given frequency. How fast can my magnetometer follow the field in terms of amplitude? And so if I have a resonance-based one and I jump too fast, then I'm jumping off my resonance. So it is related to bandwidth, but it is also, so for example, that's where the non-driven magnetometers are really better, right? If I had a magnetometer that's not in a closed loop, then I don't have that bandwidth limitation. So FID would be better for this particular application. Yes.
And if you can go back to the previous slide, you said that you have to measure with 2 sensors, and where are they located? In the black box over there?
So if I want to make measurements in my lab on Earth, I cannot hold my magnetic field stable. And so I can't distinguish, is it my magnetometer or is it my reference field drifting, or Earth magnetic field drifting? So if I want to, in this case, we put it inside a magnetic shield, and then we just put 2 of these sensors inside. Or we can also do it just in, we do it outside shields in the lab, but we always put 2 just to make sure it's not just the ambient field that is fluctuating. So we're measuring the difference between the 2. Then in space, that would not be the case, because in space, I'm actually trying to measure what that ambient field is doing. I want to see the changes. It's just in the lab, otherwise I can't see anything, because my field always drifts away, and I don't know, is it my sensor or the field?
Right, then you also measure the gradient of the magnetic field.
You're right, that if my gradient shifted, it would still start drifting, because I essentially made a gradiometer, yes. The shield? Well, so in the application, I don't want the shield. Like when I put it on the satellite, I don't want any shield, I want to measure it. It's just in my lab, in order to assess what my magnetometer can do, I put it inside a shield, because otherwise all I'm measuring is that cell phone and the car driving by, and I need to have a contained environment that is controlled enough that I can actually see what my magnetometer is doing. And so that's when I use the shield. So that shield is not miniaturized. It's we have all sizes, but it's really just a means of testing my magnetometer. Then when I want to, in an application, I don't want that shield anymore. I want to measure whatever the field is. Although there are applications where I still want to contain it and put my sample inside, then I might want to miniaturize my magnetic field shield, my magnetic shield as well. But usually in our case, we haven't miniaturized too much of that.
Like that, then how would you use such a small sensor or to, kind of eliminate the noise?
Yeah, I'll get more to that later, to specifically the brain imaging applications. In that case, yes, you do want to shield. You want to put your person inside something that is shielding away a lot of the external noise, or at least there are those applications that tend to be either rooms or tubes that you put your person inside. But there are also ideas of, can we make it even smaller? Like, can we miniaturize the shield and actually have it on your head? One of the hard parts about that is that there's also noise from the shield. It's conductive, so the electrons moving around, which causes noise. And so you don't want to make your shield too small, because now that creates noise in your system too. So, but we can talk more about that. I think I'm getting on a tangent.
Happen to have an example where you can put it on a drone to navigate, use it for navigation or something, then the limitations of having it so small are the advantages per se. So
yeah, I did not put the drone application in here, but I can say something about it in just a little bit when I talk about the geomagnetic ones. I can say a word about that.
So I have a question for the next slide. You mentioned before that you also measure the magnitude of the magnetic field. And you said that here you use 3 modulations to deduct all the 3 components of it. Wouldn't it be enough just to use 2 modulations and calculate the third one?
Absolutely, yeah. We measure the scalar value, and 2 components would give us the third one. We measure 3 because it gives us redundancy, and it helps us. It's a fault check.
Okay, I see.
You're right that 2 are good enough to calculate the vector if you have the scalar. And so the scalar is kind of the DC value. All right, let's move to a different application. And so let's jump to the other extreme, when we want to measure something really, really small. And so in this case, we asked, well, can we build a compact camera, so multi-channel system that works on very small size scales? And for our magnetometer, small size scales are kind of tens to hundreds of microns. I think going much smaller, I would say I wouldn't use an atomic magnetometer anymore. The NV centers are way better at those smaller size scales. But we're wondering, how good can you make a magnetometer that is kind of on the tens to hundreds of microns? And so we built this system. We have our atoms now in a very thin vapor cell. The vapor cell is 200 micron thick. We shine our light through the sample, through the vapor cell, through the atoms. We reflect it back, and then we image onto a photodiode array. And in this case, our photodiode array is a 4x4 array. And so the first thing is, in order for that to work, our atoms have to be stationary on these types of sizes, like, because they're in a gas, they fly around. And so we use very high buffer gas pressures that over the measurement time or the decoherence time make the atoms stable on a length scale of tens of microns. So if we're at an atmosphere or 2 or 3, we're well within that range where 1 pixel, it's not that we pump atoms and then they zip over into the other pixel and they smear out my picture. So that's the limitation of how small I can go, is kind of how high of a pressure can I create. And so then what we did is we changed the diameter. So the length was always 200 micron, and then we changed the diameter of this pixel size that we measured. And so this is actually in a zero field condition. So we measured the zero field resonance. And so if we illuminated our full cell, we got to somewhere here, maybe 40 femtotesla per root hertz. And then as we shrunk our pixels, we could clearly see it's getting worse because we have fewer and fewer atoms. But at pixel sizes kind of 50 micron, we still reached something like 300 femtotesla per root hertz. And so that was fairly encouraging. for building this camera. And so we set out to build this camera, and we're still working on it. So we haven't quite made it work yet. But this was kind of an initial scaling of saying, this was experimental data of saying, does something like this make sense? And so we've been looking at different applications where now you want to image samples in the millimeter size range. So we looked at neurons that are in like outside the body, and also nanoparticle detection for this one. Yes, Arne.
So cool. I'm just wondering, how far is the vapor from the sample? Like with, I mean, you showed it a bit, there's a bit of overhead there, and I'm just wondering.
Exactly. So we have about 100 micron of glass, then we have a gap of about 200 micron, another 100 micron of glass. So like, let's say 500 microns or something like that. So there is some overhead because first we need to keep the sample cool while we're heating our cell. And second, there's a window, there's a mirror, there's something. And so, but I think if it's roughly on the order of our thickness, that still makes sense. If my gap is much bigger than the thickness of, or the size of my pixel, then we're in the far field, and I don't think this makes any sense because everything will be smeared out. And so I don't think, maybe you can engineer it smaller, but I really don't think it makes sense to use atoms anymore, any of them.
Well, it's already cool that you can go down to 50 micrometer thickness and still get decent sensitivity.
Width.
Yeah,
thickness
sorry.
is still 200.
What's thickness again? 200.
Yeah.
Okay.
And again, we can change the thickness too, but it's much harder to change because every time I'm doing a new wafer, while it's really easy to change in lithography the lateral directions. And so that was just an example, kind of, that is on the far other side of spanning kind of from images I'm trying to do kilometers to tens of microns, and essentially with very similar systems. And so let's talk about something else in between. And so while I'm not talking about the geophysical here, putting my magnetometer on drones, this application space here, they're kind of very similar. And so here we built a imaging array, and that is 32 of these posts, and they look like trees, but you can see them here. They're carbon fiber posts, and they have 2 magnetometers inside. And these magnetometers are also the same or very similar MZ magnetometers to the space magnetometers. And so we built this array of magnetometers, and we put them in the mountains of Colorado. This is actually an old mining site. We have lots of mines because originally Colorado was, they looked for gold. So there are holes and tunnels everywhere. And so this is an educational mine from the university in Golden. And so they let us put that magnetometer somewhere on their property. And so this has been running continuously for just over a year now. We have just monitored the magnetic field and looked for different activity. And so we call this a surveillance system because we can see that people that drive by and use the facilities there. And so one thing we've been using it for is to measure geomagnetic activity, kind of as a magnetic observatory. And we do. And so this is in Colorado where the mine is. And then up here in Boulder, about 56 kilometers away, we have a magnetic observatory run by USGS, so the United States Geological Survey State. And so they have an array of magnetometers, and they publish their data. And so we can compare. And so this is what we measured. And so the black is our magnetometer array, and the blue one is what USGS data measured 56 kilometers away. And so we see a lot of geomagnetic activity. Specifically, we've seen this, which is one of the geomagnetic storms. And so it's kind of interesting that over those large distances, we can see correlations between the two sites. But then we also see more local things, and we can actually image with that array. And so this is kind of typical raw data. We see it's mostly flat, and then we see these blips coming about. And so we image where that is. We know where our posts are. We can reconstruct where that activity comes from, and this is where it came from, and we overlaid it with Google Maps, and that is the road. And so there's service personnel coming up to the mine, there's students driving up to the mine, and so we can see them come up and down and follow the path. And so this is one of these applications where I think these magnetometer arrays can be used for imaging. We can image down. We can also see people that walk through the mine. It's an educational mine, so they go in and out, and students do, I don't know what they do there. But they go in and out. It's a service tunnel. They mostly, I think, store stuff in there, but we can see it. And so it's a nice demonstration that we can actually localize in 3 dimensions where this activity is coming from. Yes.
How much area can we cover with this array kind of sensor?
Sorry?
With this array sensor, how much area can we cover?
How much area can we cover? So I think in this case, the posts are maybe 50 meters from each other currently. So this is about 50 meters. Right now, we only have the yellow and red ones here. So yeah, maybe 2 soccer fields is what we have currently. But you could certainly also see if you can push it further, or so it depends on what you want to image. You would put your posts, or you would adjust your array to what you're looking for. In our case, I don't know. That's what we picked.
What does the color differentiate? Yellow?
Oh, that was over time. We first only built 8, and we put them here, and then we have 32 as the yellow ones, and we haven't built the blue ones. We're still trying to get money to build more. Yes.
So what's the sensitivity and bandwidth of the devices, and is the data available?
Currently, it's at least not published. I think there's no problem with sharing the data. So we don't have, so we have this, it's all on our server. It's just jamming up our server. So we're certainly happy to share it with people in some ways.
And what's the sensitivity and bandwidth of a sensor?
The sensor bandwidth is about 500 hertz.
Oh.
And the sensitivity, a picotesla per hertz, or maybe half is the best, are the best ones. And then so as you have the 64 sensors, because each post has 2.
That's probably the most sensitive device for dark photons, dark matter. In certain aspects. We have a couple of experiments looking unshielded into magnetic fields of Earth. And
we can certainly talk about it. It's been running, and it keeps running.
And what's the sampling rate? Like kilohertz or? No,
1 kilohertz is the sample rate right now, because our bandwidth isn't any higher. So we've been just, there's too much data.
That's crazy. That's very good. And it's a single axis sensitivity, basically.
But it's a scalar. So whatever your Earth field is pointing, that's the component you really measure.
Very interesting.
I have a quick question on your other slide where you had this mine array and then you compared it with something else, 57 kilometers apart or something like that. Yeah, to 6. So what exactly is correlating here? Is it the Earth's magnetic field or something?
Exactly. This was a geomagnetic storm that came through. And so this is the data from the magnetic observatory that USGS has, and the data that we measured with that array. So all the sensors added together, because we didn't want to measure gradients. And so they correlate over a distance of 56 kilometers. the two arrays are 56 kilometers apart. And so these big geomagnetic activities. So people are building observatories just to measure that, because these geomagnetic storms, they can actually destroy infrastructure because they create ground currents and things like that. So people are interested in monitoring geomagnetic storms, and we managed to capture one of them. And so in this case, we do the imaging because we have the posts distributed, and then we see something. To come back to your question of putting these sensors on drones, the same sensors, scalar and vector, we also put on drones. And here's a picture of one of these quadcopters. It has actually 4 of those magnetometers. It's these white dots you can see there. And so you can fly over activity as well, and search for stuff. But the thing is that usually you only have one drone or a few, so you do need to scan an area to make an image. With vector sensors, there's much less of scanning, but with scalars, the typical way, and it's called magnetic anomaly detection. Originally, you try to find submarines. That's what a lot of these methods originally in the 70s or in the 80s were already developed to find submarines under the ocean. You can find all sorts of stuff. You can find old archaeological structures by scanning, and so people don't have to dig it up. They scan over it and find it. They can fly on drones. You can tow them behind boats. That's what people have done with some of our sensors too, tow them behind boats because they're trying to find stuff buried under the ocean. And so there's lots of geophysical applications where people want to scan over big areas and find stuff that they can't see, right? Because it's buried under rock or ocean or something like that. And none of that is new. What's new is that we can now make smaller magnetometers with lower power, so we can fly them with smaller and smaller vehicles. All right. Maybe I switch to my last application because I think I'm slowly running out of time too, right? And so this is brain imaging, and this is really close to my heart. I've been working in this field for 15 years now. And so one of the companies is actually building a functional brain imaging system. And so the motivation of why we need to improve our imaging abilities of the brain is really that first, it's a large burden on the people that are affected. If you look at the majority of these applications or these diseases, a lot of them are really nasty diseases. And the reason why it's so expensive for countries is first that every 5th person suffers from a diagnosable mental disorder, and that's scary. That's 20%, and we can start counting in this room, right? How many people of us are affected by something that is diagnosable. And so some of these statistics you can find in these references down there. So 20% is really big, and there's a lot of money and effort to address these. And so one thing that a lot of these have in common is really the reason why it's so expensive, because they don't kill you. They just make your life really miserable. Like, I mean, cancer is also nasty, but it kills people very fast. And so a lot of these people have to live with this for 50 years or so. And so that's partially why it becomes expensive. And then also, as you can see, some of these like dementias here very high up, we have an aging society. So it becomes a bigger and bigger issue. And some of those are also not fun to deal with for the affected person, but also the people around them. And so often we really don't know enough about these diseases yet. And so mostly we're treating the symptoms. And so better brain imaging tools can hopefully help diagnose faster, differentiate diagnoses, and help treatment. And so I want to talk a little bit about what are the brain imaging modalities we currently have. And so I have spatial resolution on this axis and temporal resolution here. And the workhorse is MRI.
Yeah, it's okay, because you're just answering my question, because I wanted to ask if you're talking about MRI. All right.
Yes.
Thanks a lot. Anyways.
So what MRI measures is water distribution, proton spin. So water distribution in your brain. And it's really not functional. Like it tells you what is where in your brain. And it's a good diagnosis for something like cancer. It's really good. For some stroke, it's good. But it doesn't tell you function. It just tells you where is stuff. And so it gets very high spatial resolution, and it's also really slow. If you want function, you need to measure something else than just water. And so there's functional MRI. And so it largely measures oxygen. Deoxygenated versus oxygenated blood gives you a different signature. So you can see where's oxygen, and oxygen relates to function. You need oxygen to have energy. And so there is a correlation. The correlation is really good in some ways, and in other ways, this what they call hemodynamic barrier means that not every function translates into, or just because there's oxygen doesn't always mean there's function or useful function. So there's that in between. It doesn't measure function directly, but it measures that your brain is doing something because it's using oxygen there. So the spatial resolution is usually not quite as high, but it measures oxygen. Then you can measure glucose. That tends to be the radio tracer methods like PET or SPECT. So you inject a radioactive material. It's accumulating in glucose, or it's bound to glucose, and so it accumulates in areas where, again, energy is used. You can also bind it to a few other things, and so it's also an indirect measure. It's measuring where is again energy consumed in the body. If you want to measure the direct electrophysiology, so what are your neurons doing inside the brain, you have EEG, so electroencephalography. Those are the electrodes you glue. Usually they have some dry ones, but they glue to your scalp. These nets you put on your head with some contact fluid, and you can pick up the activity, and you can do that really fast. So nothing in the brain is really fast. I'm a really slow thinker. So millisecond is fast. And so you can do that on these types of timescales. You can pick up the activity fast, but you don't really know where it is so well, because there's a conductivity between where the activity arises and then until it gets to those electrodes. So the conductivity of all these different layers that in between are distorting the signal. So your spatial resolution is not great, but you can do it kind of in real time of what the brain is seeing. And then if you want to see a little bit better where things are, you can use the magnetic equivalent to EEG. So instead of gluing electrodes or contacting electrodes to your head, you place magnetic field sensors around, and you measure the magnetic field that's naturally coming out, and you get slightly higher spatial resolutions because the magnetic fields are not distorted from the tissue and the skull. And the fluids that are in between. But if you want really high spatial and temporal resolution, currently the only way is to drill a hole into your scalp and put electrodes inside. And then you get kind of this really high temporal and spatial resolution. And when I say high, I mean kind of millisecond temporal and millimeter spatial resolution. And so here you can see some of these electrodes. They look like kebab skewers, is what the epileptologist always says. And that's, of course, not necessarily what people like. So, but this is kind of where we want to be. So there is a method for the current magnetoencephalography. That was the, whoops, yeah, that's where we want it to be, there. This method here, so kind of making videos of the electrical activity of the neurons in real time over the cortex. And what we really want is like go down there. So this is the current existing technology. So we have action potentials, and they create currents inside your brain, and the current creates a magnetic field around, and then we can pick up that magnetic field on the outside of the scalp, and we do it all over the head, and then can reconstruct where the activity is coming from. And so we can't see single neurons. We see about 10 to the 5 of them. So clusters of them. So the cortex is really nice because we have the pyramidal cells. They're all nice and parallel, so all the signals add up. And then what I see on the outside of the head is about 10 femtotesla of magnetic field change due to these 10 to the 5 pyramidal cells in there. And so what these existing systems are, they're gigantic liquid helium doers that have about 300 magnetometers or gradiometers sitting on the bottom. And you stick your head inside and you measure the activity on the outside. And so it's large infrastructure because you have to maintain that liquid helium and these giant doers. It's a very fixed system. It's also, so it's cryogenic and very expensive. And so what we really want to do is, can we build small magnetometers and now have an uncooled alternative to these cryogenic systems. So this is the sensor we built. It's one of those Hanle magnetometers, a zero field magnetometer operating in the surf regime. I have my laser, again, I have my optics here. I have my small vapor cell, in this case, also about 3 millimeters on the side, and my photodiode. And then I have a coil system that is always keeping my magnetic field at 0 in all 3 directions. And so the output of the magnetometer is really how much current am I putting on these coils to keep them in that zero field condition. And so here the size is like about 13 by 15 millimeters. So this is a few sugar cubes. And so then when we kind of compare, this is the cryogenic system. Here's a person inside. We have our sensors. And the closest I can get my sensor here, there's about a 2 centimeter gap because I have to have this doer in between. And then, of course, my head usually doesn't fit perfectly into something static. If we compare that to a system where we can really measure on scalp, so move the sensors directly on the head, then you can see when we measure the same type of signal, this is a brain signal in response to a beep in your ear. You get a response of about, let's say, 500 femtotesla in these systems, and 1.5 picotesla, so 3 times as high in the OPM, in the atomic magnetometer type systems. You can see that the noise is also higher still. So the noise floor of these sensors is about 15 femtotesla per hertz, and this one is about like 3 to 5. So in this scenario, the signal to noise is very similar. Just looking at the SNR, by now people have actually managed to find higher SNRs with these on-scalp systems. If you start measuring children, if you start measuring people with non-standard heads, then of course the difference becomes better in favor of the on-scalp systems because they move with the head size. But if you're trying to develop a new technology for an application space, it's actually a really long route. And so we started in 2009 with the first system we built. We had 2 sensors. We took it to Berlin. They have an amazing shielded room. They know brain imaging. We had no idea. Every year we built a new system, and a new grad student or postdoc would travel with that system to Berlin and validate it in brain imaging. And it took a really, really long time for the community to see that there's a real advantage in this. And so the reason why I'm saying is we build these novel sensors and we're so convinced they work well in our application, and we can even demonstrate all this nice advantage, and then nobody wants them because they're like, what's wrong with the way I'm doing it right now? Or I don't really trust this. And so this validation over and over has really taken about 10 years. And then after 10 years, it started to take off because people are seeing, oh, I get all of these advantages. I can get higher spatial resolution. I can put it on children. The children can now move with it. They're not stuck in this thing and say, and we say, be still, but act naturally. So we can start studying in paradigms and in paradigms that are more natural, where people are moving. And so there's a lot of advances that we have shown, or I'm now saying as our community, not me, that it makes sense to adopt this technology, but it took 10 years until there was this kink in adoption and people are actually seeing this is viable. And that's kind of when it went into commercial development. And that's also where some of it becomes boring. Like, I don't build one, I need 1,000. This is 1,000 sensors, all these gray different lines, and they kind of have to do the same thing, and they all have to perform. And you can see there's a variation in terms of noise floor, but it is fairly narrow. And so we have to learn, how do we make, how do we scale up? And so I just have a few applications off brain images. I don't know if I have any more time, because I have time. Okay. We started to make these systems first in research. We built the first 128 channel system, and the grad students hated it. They liked the first 5, but not the rest of the 100 and whatever. And so we realized very fast that this is not really something scaling up. It's not something you can demonstrate in research very well. And so, but there was this customer pull of saying, we want these systems now. You showed us how good they work. Can you make them? And so we did found a company. And so this is the results of one of these systems. Here you see a picture, 128 of these magnetometers. They're on these spokes inside the helmet. So you put the person in, and then you push all the sensors in to touch the head to get high spatial resolution. And this is the system that is at Anschutz Medical Campus at the University of Colorado in Denver. This is the MEG Center. You can see the squid system in the back, because we still do a lot of validation where we run now each epilepsy patient that comes through is routinely scanned with a cryogenic system, and then in addition we offer these scans. And so this is the type of activity that we see. We usually can't see, so for epileptic activity, we can see it in real time, but for a lot of other things, we need to average. So let's say you hear a beep in your ear, you measure the response, and then you average over 100 beeps so that you get a little bit higher signal to noise. And so this is, for example, data in response to a beep to the left ear. So on the right side, you see response in your auditory cortex after 130 milliseconds. And then a few milliseconds later, it actually moves to both and then moves over to the left, even though you only hear it in your left ear. And that's something very typical. And so you need to reconstruct out of this these 128 signals, you reconstruct where is your activity in the brain. And this is a very typical, we call sensory measurement. One of the big applications is epilepsy. Partially because really the only way to locate epileptic spikes right now is invasive. So either with the deep electrodes or with a net of electrodes on the cortex. You need to implant them, and then you localize where the activity is, and then you actually cut it out. That is the procedure that you have to do on patients that are drug resistant, that don't respond to drugs. And that's about a third of the epilepsy patients. And these surgeries are very expensive, but you see how high the morbidity is because you have to sit there with an open scalp for about 2 weeks. And so it is the likeliness of infection is very high. And so people are trying to find non-invasive ways to localize these spikes. And so this is data now from the system I just showed you. In this case, we had 138 magnetometers, and we just took the raw data, we filtered it, and we ran it through a spatial filter reconstruction. It's called a kurtosis beamformer. And what it does is it steps through the voxels and says, with what likelihood did the activity come from this area? And so then you can, in one of these epileptic spikes, you can then say, we believe it came from that area. And so that's one of those standard analyses, and this was for an epilepsy patient in this case. There's also some other really interesting research. This is Alzheimer's research from the University of San Francisco.
Sorry, can I ask a question to the epilepsy? Just wondering, I mean, that is a dramatic incident, right? You have a seizure like that.
But you want to know where it starts. You cannot, once the seizure is there, you don't measure anything. You measure muscles and everything is firing.
Oh.
But you want to know where it originates.
But you also don't trigger it, right? I mean, do you have the patient there sitting with your helmet for until it happens, or?
No, these are spikes. These are interictal spikes. So even if you don't have an epileptic seizure, there's these small blips you measure in a lot of the epilepsy patients. Not everyone, but a lot of them. And so they're not strong enough to trigger a full seizure, but they originate from a similar area. And so people want to know, where is that? If you can catch a seizure, that's another step. Of course, we would like to, but that means we have to get these systems into the long-term monitoring units, because we can't get the person out. And so that's what people are currently trying. That would be another step. This is interictal spikes between the seizures.
And those spikes are dominating the rest of the brain in terms of signal size?
Yes.
How big are they?
Picotesla. Yes, that's right behind you.
I'm wondering about the morbidity. That's almost 1 in 4. And I'm just wondering why anybody would do that, and whether that's how one can ethically justify. I mean, I guess in the long run, you will maybe find a cure for it, but still 1 in 4 people dies.
No, that's morbidity. This is they don't die, but they get an infection. They get so the mortality is not as high. I agree that if really 1 in 4 die, I don't think anybody would do this unless they have no quality of life. But people often don't have a lot of quality. They don't respond to seizures. They can't drive. They often can't work in jobs where they can suddenly be dysfunctional completely. And so it is very impactful. And so the epileptologist actually had us go into the hospital and talk to these people, because he's like, you need to see what they're going through, why they're sitting here with their brain open for 2 weeks. You need to understand. And so we actually went and talked to people and heard how disabling it can be. And so I think that's kind of a good motivator why we need to work harder.
Thank you. So these were taken with head scan, MEG, and all these sensors on the helmet. Yes. So I realized that some activities are somewhere deep in the brain. So how deep, or what is the furthest signal, or the point that originates the signal? How furthest can we actually measure? Because it is not close to the sensor itself.
So there have been demonstration of really deep structures like hippocampus or so, but not many so far. And it really has 2 reasons. One is, yes, it's deeper, and so my field falls off. My signal strength falls off with distance cubed, let's say. So of course I have a smaller signal, but also in the cortex, you have these pyramidal cells that are all nicely parallel. And in some of those structures, you just don't have that nice arrangement. So it is much harder to image some of those deeper structures, but there's a lot of interest, and people have managed to image them, but it's not as easy as cortical signals. So both are kind of against you on that front, going deeper.
I'm just curious, how much power do you put in to get this sensitivity, and what kind of material do you use for the hamlet? And there are a lot of fibers on the hamlet. Is it for signal collection, or and do you get some loss in the fiber?
All right, so there's a lot of questions. So let's say, so each of these sensors, so the sensor sits in just this translating spoke, and each sensor has a cable. There's no optical fibers. The laser is on the sensor itself. The laser power is about 250 microwatts. That's the laser power we get out of these lasers. The majority is the power. So the biggest power consumption comes from, we need to heat the vapor cell. And so that is maybe 500 milliwatts or so per vapor cell. So that's the biggest power consumer in our system. But even the 128, it's not more than 1,000 watts. So you just plug it into a normal outlet.
Also, local heating on the skin.
So we need to, of course, do a lot of thermal management inside these. We have to comply with a surface temperature set by the FDA is 43 degrees. And so we do have to do a lot of thermal management. And it is something the OPM makers are learning, how to control that heat and not have it go into the subject, but rather stay in your vapor cell.
So everybody who wants to ask questions, I want to ask questions as well, but we have just officially, it's 5 minutes left. We would give another 6 minutes because you started late, but I'm super interested in all the other things that she has to maybe show.
But I can also just stop here. The rest is just showing a few other.
That's what I don't want you to do.
So if there's more interesting questions for the system, so the rest is some other examples of why would you do this in brain imaging? But I didn't have anything else on other types of applications past brain imaging.
But it's like 10 minutes and we have plenty. Actually, you're not going to leave, right? You're going to stay. She's going to moderate the exercise session and everything. We can put some questions into the exercise session. I don't want to do strong arm this, but that would be my suggestion, that we hear you out and then postpone the questions into the coffee break and exercise.
I'm also happy for those people who rather want coffee to leave. But I think I just have two more examples of brain imaging applications. I think I talked to Anna, and it's going to be on YouTube, at least in some format.
We have sent the slides from Pete, for example, around. I will try, I don't know if you have slides to send around, that would also be nice.
I mean, certainly all the brain imaging things are publicly available already, so I'm happy to share them. This is another example that is close to my heart because I was personally affected from a family member of this. This is Alzheimer diagnosis. And so currently there are a few different methods how you can diagnose Alzheimer that goes in different stages, and they're kind of clinically defined. And one is neurophysiological assessment. You get asked lots of questions by your neurologist, and then at some point they determine, yeah, you have dementia or you have Alzheimer's. And then the second thing is atrophy. So they measure the volume loss of your hippocampus, which is kind of the memory center of your brain. So your brain starts shrinking, and so that's another factor of diagnosis, and that is this one. And so this is the study from Sri Nagarajan at UCSF. And so he used one of these measures of just measuring resting state. So you put the person inside and you let them do nothing. And then you look at synchronization in one of those frequency bands between different brain areas. And he used that as a measure to diagnose if a person has Alzheimer's. And he has shown that even in these really early stages, you can use MEG. This was not with an OPM system, but you can use MEG to for early diagnosis. And so there's a lot of research in these types of fields, and I think this one is an encouraging one for all of us in the future. Another one that is, I think, really interesting is mild traumatic brain injuries. So it's essentially concussions, and they're really difficult to diagnose. If you have a bad concussion, you see changes on the CT or the MRI, but if you have not as bad of a concussion, you really don't see any structural changes. But often your symptoms are depressions, irritability, headaches, and they can last for years. And so it's really difficult to diagnose and also see if treatments actually help, because you're looking at these symptoms that are often like slowly changing over time. And so finding an imaging approach for that. And so one thing they found that you can use MEG, or even better, a combination of MEG and MRI to detect these mild traumatic brain injuries. And so you look at very slow frequencies in the brain, which are indicative of injury and repair. And so you can see that that they've done lots of studies on football players, but also soldiers, like a military population, and can say, yes, this person had a concussion, even though nothing showed up on these MRIs. And so that's another interesting, I think, application, because it's large. Maybe that's the ones I had. There's, of course, lots more research in the field is really big. Brain-machine interfaces is another huge field that goes in lots of different directions. That is really interesting. Autism, Parkinson's, and then psychosis, so depressions, schizophrenia. So the field is really big of research within this field, and so it is really interesting that we can now provide tools to a whole society of researchers that we're hoping can do something really good with it. And so that's interesting. And then what I showed was really a large amount of people contributed to all of these different projects. And then I just wanted to show that by now we have over 30 of these brain imaging systems that we distributed all over the world. And luckily, we're not the only company. There are 7 companies now, I think. So they're growing rapidly, that are building these systems for both brain imaging, but also cardio, so other biomagnetic applications. And so I think we'll see more of that in clinical research as these systems start being approved clinically and not just for research. But thank you. Maybe I'll stop here.
So we have a few questions more, like there would be 5 minutes more for questions. Sorry for cutting you off, Ali.
A quick question. How long does it take to have this MEG scan of a brain?
Okay, that depends a little bit what you're looking for. In most paradigms, currently with the noise floor we have, we average for between 1 and 5 minutes. But for example, for epilepsy, we try to have the person sleep in there because you don't know when those spikes happen. So that's when you want an hour if you can get it, because you're waiting for an event. But if we look for something specific, usually within 5 minutes, you have plenty of data. But as we push our noise floors, it'll of course go faster. and it goes with the square of the noise. So we have a big incentive to push the noise down.
Another question? Wow.
All the head scans happen in a shielded room. Yes? All the head scans happen in the shielded room.
All these head scans happen in a shielded room. That's right. I promised to say something about shields and I didn't. Thank you for reminding me. Yes, all of these are in shielded rooms. And there's really two reasons. One is because they work in the surf regime currently where we get the highest sensitivity. And for that, we have to have the ambient magnetic field low compared to the precession frequency, compared to the collision frequency. And so the other reason is really that all this other stuff creates noise that is way larger than my brain signal. If I can measure a brain signal, even with a shield, I can see the elevator and I can see things happening and I have to reject all of that. So magnetic imaging is to a large extent a noise rejection game. And so currently, if you want to measure unshielded brain, which there has been one demonstration by Tom Cornack, and I think it's really neat and it's a really cool direction, but I wouldn't try it in a hospital, at least not yet. So there's a lot to be developed, and that's mostly on the noise rejection side. But of course, also we need to improve the sensors that are unshielded. One advantage that I do get from making the system smaller rather than gigantic door is I don't need a room necessarily. So depending on what my application is, if I can build a that looks like an MRI, and I push my person in and I take them back out. And for some applications that works. For some application it just doesn't because the person just wouldn't be still, or I'm trying to movement is important to my study or something like that. So now we differentiate again against what happens, but it is an option and it does reduce the cost drastically, smaller shields.
While I'm walking over there, those are all different companies.
No. These are all different people that worked on all the projects I showed. So the Cosmo is the space project. This is one of the scalar projects, the magnetic camera. This is the CU Anschutz team that works on the brain imaging. So these are all people that have contributed to all the things I've shown, and not just the brain stuff here.
What's the blue sensor?
That is, somebody drew that dot. They thought the Emirates were down here. So it's a little embarrassing, that question.
So, hi, thank you for the nice talk. Essentially, I have two questions coming from the question on how deep can you see, right? Does the top layer of the brain act like a shielding for the signal inside? And if so, how much?
No. The brain is transparent to these low frequency magnetic fields. It's just the distance. Like so your field strength falls off like 1 over r cubed, maybe r squared, depending on in which regime you're at. But so your field strength is lower the further you are from the source, but there's no shielding that's going on in between. And then second, those deeper brain areas, they're not, the neurons aren't nicely parallel organized. So it's much, the signals tend to be a lot smaller coming from deeper sources because of both of those reasons, but there's no shielding in between.
So I assume as you suggested, your sample rate is something like 500 hertz or 1 kilohertz. Would you be able to see more if with increased sample rate or the sensor bandwidth? And if so, what exactly the kind of disease would you be then looking for?
So for brain imaging, so currently our sample rate is about 1 kilohertz. Our bandwidth is 150 hertz or so currently, somewhere there. Most signals are in that low frequency space. There are a few that are kind of in the hundreds of hertz. that are starting to be interesting to people. They're fairly small compared to the lower frequency things. So again, we have to work harder to see them. I think that there would be need, but the current need is really all at those maybe out to 100 hertz. Those are the majority of signal people are looking at currently. That is different for other applications like muscles, for example. Those definitely have a lot higher frequency parts in them. But most of the brain signals happen out to about 100 hertz. But they're emerging applications. So I think in the future, absolutely.